Доброго дня, шановні колеги. Доброго дня всім, хто нас дивиться онлайн. Мене звуть
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, everybody online. I'm Oksana Ishchuk, the Executive Director of the Strategy 21 Center of Globalistics. Today we start our roundtable additional sanctions against Russia, additional opportunities. This event is supported by Renaissance organization and the Black Sea Studies Institute. This event is taking place for 6 months already, since 6 months, and we want to introduce you to the results of our project. The sanctions policy is now at such a way that after full-scale Russian aggression, several packages of sanctions have been adopted. 24th of February this year, the 10th package of sanctions was adopted by the European Union. They impose restrictions on certain entities of Russian Federation, but still there is some field for maneuvering, for evading sanctions. So we have place to impose sanctions on more entities. So we have developed a database of 200 entities worth to be imposed sanctions which don't belong to sanction list. We want to present to you our developments within this project, and we invite to the floor the president of the Globalistic Center Strategy 21, Mykhailo Gonchar, with a welcome word. And with the first presentation of our project, Mykhailo, please, the floor is to you.
Всім доброго ранку, вітання.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. This project really is a continuation of the activity
наших обох визначення
and the additional definitions to determine or define additional more opportunities for sanctions. After the beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine on 24th of the aggression of Ukraine in 2014, and then the full-scale one in February. So we were to find new directions, and along with that to show the gaps in sanctions which allowed Russia not only to accumulate additional possibilities from their side, but also to implement them by pumping up their potential, and in the context of preparation for a full-scale aggression into Ukraine, which happened on 24th February last year. In this context, I would like to show just few slides which illustrate exactly that position, that provision that the sanctions regimes which were imposed against Russia since 2014 turned out to be insufficient for Russia to refuse from its aggressive plans. A little bit of the background. The expansionism is proper for Russia since Soviet times, and we see that at the peak of oil prices grow, that is where Russia used aggressive actions. You can see that practically from the Soviet time, the years from 75 to 85, there was a Russian aggression to Afghanistan. Then in the post-Soviet period, we can see how these aggressive actions of Russia were increasing. And oil price growing and accordingly growing of earnings of income Russia profited from were in line. Can you pay attention to this yellow oval, which shows that in the period when low prices were at the global petroleum market, Russia was in difficult times, starting since the Soviet times, and basically speaking, it resulted in the collapse of USSR and 10 years of low profile development of Russia. Talking about the modern period, about our times, we can see that the energy perpetuum mobile of Russian aggression continues to work. This table contains some data which shows the dynamics of growth in 10 years, increase, decrease of Russia's incomes. It's important to pay attention to the numbers highlighted in red. In one case it is light red, in another case the dark red highlighted. It goes about that at the minimum of oil price, Russia anyway has got about $366 billion of early income from energy sources export. It happened in 2013 compared with the other years. In 2016 and in 2020 it was twice as lower income. But the low petroleum incomes have never stopped Russia in its aggressive policy. Pay attention to the results of 2022. Notwithstanding all sanctions, Russia has got almost $345 billion of income, almost record ones, and it's actively using them to continue aggression against Russia and the undermining activities against Europe. In this context, and we highlight it in our conclusions through our projects, through our work, that the sanctions of 10 packages undertaken by now, which significantly impact Russian petroleum sector. They do work, but they are not sufficient. We shall talk about this later. The colleagues will mention about it, but here it goes exactly on that new sanction approaches have to be developed, and the gaps, the holes, so say, which appeared in the process of sanctions use, and it goes about the current sanctions mode. Sorry, no sound from the speaker.
Маємо короткі технічні проблеми.
We have certain technical difficulties.
Чи чутно мені, скажіть, будь ласка, колеги? Чи мене чутно?
Вас чутно, але Михайло ні.
Так.
Unfortunately, the speaker is out of sound.
В такому разі, для того, щоб
Okay, so not to
я б хотіла би надати слово
make a long pause, I would like to give the floor now to the representatives of the International
дуже вдячні.
Foundation Renaissance, because the project is being supported by this foundation. Mr. Dmitro is invited to the floor, please.
Добрий день.
Good day. I will tell very briefly. It's a special pleasure of that such an event takes place now. Everybody understands the topicality of this event. Everybody who participates in this discussion know how important the topic is and how much the results of this work are useful for Ukraine. I would like just to thank colleagues for the work performed. Would be very nice to restitute connection for Mykhailo Gonchar to continue talking. I just would like to clarify, maybe I missed in the beginning, it was already said, but the format of bringing to international audience, could you tell how do you plan to bring it to the colleagues abroad, also in some public format? I understand there are many non-public information in the results, but our key messages have to be translated to abroad. First of all, to those who are engaged in sanctions development and imposition, designation. So those messages have to be delivered with good quality. I know many organizations abroad who do work in this area and who would be interested for these materials. We can also give this information for them. I would like to stress on that this work serves not only for European audience, for Ukrainian audience, but also for the foreign audience. It's very important. Thanks you, Mr. Dmytro. To answer your question, want to tell you that a database of entities to be sanctioned supposedly have been developed. Obviously, much of that information is confidential. Now we are developing some proposals how to expand the sanctions policy. Later on in the course of the project, it's planned to deliver, to submit to our foreign partners through further events, also online events, with participation of the representatives of foreign embassies and the Ukrainian government. Also, an analytical report will be presented upon the results of our project. Today, we are delivering the results we have achieved, the database of the entities. And we briefly are talking about possible ways of improvement of sanctions policy, which would be reasonable for today. Because we see that not all the entities participating in the military defense sector and energy sector of Russia are under sanctions. Due to the technical difficulties with the previous speakers, the floor is now given to Andrii Klymenko, Editor-in-Chief of VlackSeaNews website. Please, Andrii, the floor is to you. Colleagues, welcome everybody. I want to begin with tell few basic aspects. First of all, for a long time, together with Tetyana Guchakova, we are dealing in the topic of sanctions. Since 2014, since Crimean occupation time, for a long time in the Western world, it was believed that the sanctions are used so to change the policy of Russian Federation. All these years through, we have been saying, unfortunately, the West didn't hear to us. And only with the beginning of the large war, more than 1 year ago, our Western friends understood that the sanctions will not change the policy of Russia. So the purpose and main goal of sanctions now, and we are happy about that, to reduce the possibility of Russian Federation to wage an aggressive war. As regards financial aspect, Mykhailo Gonchar started to talk about the petroleum incomes of Russian budget. Also from the point of view of defense, industrial complex of Russian Federation. Tetyana Guchakova will take floor to talk more in detail about this. I just want to say I was very much surprised when a couple of weeks ago several serious representatives of European countries said we have exhausted almost all the leverages, almost all the entities in Russia which were deserving sanctions. We applied sanctions against them. Those statements are not true. One of our main tasks in this project was to find out, describe, and collect information about those entities of Russian Federation which manufacture weapons, munition, missiles, drones, meaning the tools, everything that we are feeling upon ourselves, all Ukrainian, including the yesterday's night. So I now ask to pass the floor to Tetyana Guchakova. Thank you. Good day. I will tell a little bit about the results of work of our group on searching and detecting and finding out those Russian entities, first of all, of defense sector, those who are worth to be imposed international sanctions, and also why those sanctions haven't been yet imposed. It is not this easy work, and we needed a special group task force to be created for that. It's obvious, but I'll remind you briefly how Russia was closing information sources during the recent years. The registry of the entities of defense industrial complex is closed since September of 2014. Before that, they were boasting of the defense entities, talked a lot about cooperation, about the successes of Crimean defense entities, but the sanctions were implemented at that time, and then the state defense procurement ordering in Russia takes in the closed mode since February 2017, the so-called black box of state defense procurement, the closed military trading platform. And then those entities obtained the opportunity not to place any official information on the procurement. The registry of individuals, of beneficiaries, started to hide the data on the owners and beneficiaries. In certain cases also about the licenses since March 21. There is a list of information in the area of military and military technical activities, which, in case of being supported by foreign sources, can be used against the security of Russia. Among that information, it goes about cooperation, manufacturing cooperation in the weapons development and procurement, and also dual-purpose products manufacturing, and generally the needs for import of high-tech products. From that list of information, which also was closed, this is a recognition of very high role of sanctions, which can reduce the possibility of produce weapons, at least modern weapons. In our list of proposal of suggestion for sanctions, there are 175 legal entities acting in critically important economic branches in Russia who are directly to produce to manufacture products directly and indirectly participating in the war against Ukraine. Those are not just lists. There is English and Russian and Ukrainian language information about those entities. Plus also the evidences of connection of those entities to the war in Ukraine. Among those are entities cooperating with the companies which are already under sanctions. We have 12 entities in the list for air building, aircraft building, another for participating in the military space programs of Kremlin. 5 entities connected to manufacturing of missile techniques, missile weapons, 11 for production of explosive munition. Other companies participating in manufacturing of armoring systems, and 4 for anti-air defense systems, radio location, radio electronic fighting systems. Another 51 entities are directly participating in manufacturing and repair of all kind of weapons without narrow specialization, and there is a long list to be referred. There are also manufacturing of communication system, radio electronic product, participating in defense complex, military optics, and other products used by defense industries. There are 11 scientific and research centers and institutes working in that field. I unfortunately cannot tell you any specific name. It is still early. We shouldn't spoil the celebration, so-called, for Russians. But if seriously we are now competing, who will be more quick and efficient, those who impose sanctions, including with export restrictions, or that one who looks ways and methods to evade them? So the best option is now to wait for that time when our proposals and suggestions will be accepted by the relevant authorities, bodies in US, EU and UK. Currently, since 24th of February last year, all the process have been accelerated a lot. For example, during the time of our group's preparation of proposals, a new package of sanctions was adopted where 43 legal entities from our list have come. 19 of those have been included in Ukrainian sanctions list only. Those are entities we shall propose to our partners in EU and US for sanctions with the relevant evidence base. Because being under Ukrainian sanctions doesn't automatically mean inclusion in other countries' sanctions. Also, some companies which are under surveillance and sanctions of OFAC, it's very well, because after effect sanctions, very often other sanctions are used. 9 legal entities have been sanctioned by EU. We shall try to push this list to other subjects of sanction policy. 5 legal entities are in the list of 2 countries in different combinations: Ukraine plus EU, EU plus UK, EU plus Canada, etc. And only 1 legal entity is a central Science and Research Institute, Borovesnik, a known entity from Nizhny Novgorod working in the Ukrainian defense industry, has come to 4 lists: American OFAC, UL list, UK and Ukraine sanction list. It's very well. All other companies, except for Borovesnik, we are on all other entities, we are still working, except for Borovesnik. As regards adoption of imposition of sanctions on certain entities, we have been anticipated. Somebody earlier than us did it. It happens for the first time. We were dealing with it before the sanction list was prepared. Currently, all the entities we suggest are already in the list. Now everything changed, and there are many groups who search for the candidates for future sanctions, and it is very good. We are not stopping as well. We have found new candidates for sanctions, and it will allow rather quickly to propose a next list, not smaller than the previous one. What have we seen whilst analyzing the entities of Russian defense industry? First of all, preliminary conclusion can be drawn on that before full-scale Russian aggression beginning, the entities were financed not sufficiently, except for the benchmark one and those who were exporting their product. So on those entities, we could see inefficient utilization of funds due to the corruption of Russia. It's very important to implement total sanction restrictions to Russian industry, defense industry complex, to prevent them from evading. Next, in Russia, the industrial defense complex entities are multiplying. They are creating subsidiaries, trying to legally be distant from the parent companies. The available small companies are used, small enterprise. Legal entities, not sanctioned legal entities, are used, and the process of reorganization, change of names, they are using it to evade sanctions. They're doing it very actively. Also, there are many private technological companies who had their software development, drone development, radio electronics. They cooperate now with Russian Ministry of Defense, and they are hiding their information on that cooperation. At the same time, they buy electronic components abroad. The Russian industry itself, notwithstanding a great number of scientific and industrial defense industrial entities, is not able to work full-fledgedly under sanction restrictions, and switching to domestic electronic components is low probable in the nearest time. So it's very important to enhance sanctions against Russian economics, to reduce the possibility of important Western technologies development. Without those technologies, Russia will not be able to produce high-tech products, and it will drastically reduce their military capabilities. I would like to remind about peace space and peace atom, nuclear. In the process of working with those entities, we saw that the Russian defense works very actively with Rosatom, Russian nuclear agency, and with Roscosmos, Russian space agency, which participates in the development of missile weapons and uses other studies for development of those missiles. We have a large list of entities with cooperation, who cooperate with defense. The Rosatom. Everybody knows about Zaporizhian nuclear power station occupied by Russians. So we have a lot of job ahead of us. Thank you. Thank you, Tatyana. You mentioned about the Rosatom, Russian nuclear agency, and really, a number of very important companies in this sense was included to the 10th sanctions package. Rosatom, which was participating in the occupation of Zaporizhia nuclear plant, technologies, the sea policy was not included. There are many companies and entities in the power sector of Russia worth to be imposed sanctions. In December last year, oil embargo was introduced by EU, and later on embargo for petroleum products from Russia. Now we analyze the first results First conclusions from that embargo implementation. Russia mentioned that the incomes from petroleum dropped by 46% compared to last year's January. Is it really so, or was really the introduced embargo impacted the Russian industry? Ihor Stukalenko, Director of Energy Programs of Globalistic Center Strategy 21, will tell. You have the floor, Mr. Ihor. Thank you. I have certain illustrations. I will share it now. Can you see it?
Видно, пане Ігорю, все добре.
Yes, we can see it. It has a name. I gave it this name to put an accent on certain details. First of all, it is a well-known reduction, drop of the import of Russian fossil fuels, which obviously have to be a factor of sanctions policy. And for the second, there are certain other approaches so to reduce, to decrease this import. Except for direct sanctions, there are some other leverages to reduce production and import of fossil fuels from Russian Federation, being aggressor country. As estimate, Russia already loses hundreds of millions of petroleum and oil incomes, and the export dropped. At the same time, Europe imports a record amount of Russian LPG, as you can see. As a whole, Russia exported 33 billion tons, or relevant number of cubic meters of regasified gas. Practically, the nuclear or atomic complex of Russia hasn't suffered significantly. So, less Russian gas, more energy safety, and shorter way to achieve the goal of anti-Russian sanctions. How to get rid of gas import? It's not an easy task. At least two reasons are there for that. First of all, the strict link to gas pipeline networks, differently from petroleum, coal, and LPG. And for the second, the supplies
По-друге, це величезна залежність 45%, яка була на європейському ринку.
There's a great dependence, about 50%, which existed before the beginning of the war. We have several directions of substitution of Russian gas to reduce overall consumption of any gas. Reducing its reuse of other energy types, and for the second, the intensive development of green energy, renewable energy sources. Another way is to the supplies of the so-called pipe gas or network gas incoming through pipelines. At the same time, the supplies of this gas and liquefied natural gas through from non-Russian sources. Those are main ways. International Energy Agency estimates if we reduce the temperature in our houses by 1-2 degrees, we'll substitute about 10 billion cubic meters of Russian gas within the European Union. And the implementation of such measures requires the support of the society, and the complex nature of the problems required change of gas legislation. The development of EU Repower Plan providing for implementation of the above-named measures. Through the years, the Russian Gazprom was disseminating a narrative on the reliability of the gas infrastructure and the non-reliability of Ukrainian infrastructure. The last year showed the reverse, based on the example of Russian pipeline Nord Stream 1. It is a negative example. A lot of problems of issues with the equipment and reduction of gas transport and due to the so-called technical problems. In June, that problem was a Canadian turbine. We can see those timelines of problems. In July, it was planned scheduled maintenance, then another Siemens turbine in August, and the first September last year, complete stop of gas transportation through this pipeline. And there is a comment from Russian officials. The last turbine was out of operation due to leak of lubrication oil from there. And that assessment was made by Russian Federation. Before the explosion on 26th of September, the pipeline was already non-operational for 1 month. It was stopped by Gazprom, wasn't transporting gas. The lower diagram shows the dependence of European market from Russian gas. It was happening since 2001, as shown here. You can see that even the interruption of supplies in 2006, 2009. We remember how it happened in Ukraine. We have been the first country to be used gas supplies as weapon against. That all didn't significantly impacted the dependence of reduction of EU market dependence, and then the last events opened the eyes of European consumers since that point of time, the Gazprom reduced its presence in the market. So, as a result, now only 9% of Russian gas is present in the grid, in the pipeline networks market. Another factor to be paid attention to is gas underground storages. The supplies through Poland were also stopped, added to Nord Stream. The military actions of Russians make it impossible to transport gas through the relevant gas stations and through our network. Those are data of transportation of Russian gas in million cubic meters a day, BCMs. Ukrainian route of 41 million. I would remind you that the grid capacity makes 110 million, the Turkish stream 31, and overall there are 72 million cubic meters. It was less, but those are numbers now. The presence or availability of pipeline gas is much shrinked now. There are regional terminals located in Poland, Lithuania, Croatia. They issued into the network about 21 million of regasified LNG, which essentially increases the resilience of European market. The availability of the gas in the underground storage is important, and it has been proved during this winter period. To enhance market resilience, new regulation was adopted in EU, which foresees that before the 1st of November, the gas storages have to be filled at least by 90%. As of 16th November last year, really the underground storages, gas underground storages have been filled by almost 96%, or there have been 102 BCM in those storages compared with 28% found there as of 16 November 21, the previous season. Obviously, it is a significant safety factor and possibility to continue sanctions. And the winter period, which is finalizing, proved to it. On the 1st of March this year, the storages have been filled by 59%. The 64 BCM compared to last season. In the last season, there have been only 29 BCM or 28%. In March last year, it allows to talk boldly about the stability of EU gas market, and it is very important for Ukraine, which is an integral part of this market, and this taken is importing gas from this market, not from Russia. It allows us to clearly provide our consumers with gas. Liquefied natural gas. The community of LNG is increasing compared to the drop to the share of pipeline gas. You can see that in 21, the share of Russian LNG in the market was already rather high, about 20%. Last year, that share was increased up to 23 billion plus 20 versus 21, and the overall export of LNG also increased up to 45 BCM or plus 8.6%. It is not a problem to be solved. I would ask another question. The question would be, what else impacts the volume of production and export of hydrogens as such, specifically LNG increasing the condition of production? And it depends on the export of equipment and spare parts. We remember that the exit from the project of only one technological company immediately stopped for a long period the construction of Nord Stream 2. And also the supplies of Western technologies and equipment are very sensitive for LNG industry in Russian Federation. It goes not only about Western but also Russian companies which manufacture and supply the relevant equipment to produce and transport energy sources, and is used to modernize the gas transport network. When constructing modern gas producing units and other. And their customers are companies who provide income to the Russian budget from export of oil, gas and other materials. So those companies, manufacturing companies have to be in the focus of sanction policy. And the last, very important from my point of view, is civil societies, another factor of sanction policy, which may efficiently influence and impact the aggressor. The civil society of European and other democratic countries, it has powerful tools of impact which have to be used at the maximum. The public support of refusal from Russian fossil fuels have to be provided to support joint actions to increase stability and renewal of Ukrainian energy infrastructure, which suffered heavy losses last year and this year. Participation of Russian representatives in international energy organizations, conferences, events have to be stopped, or at least to restrain their rights and privileges of being there. As an example, can be taken the decision of International Atomic Agency states which are intolerant towards Russian actions. Russia is posing threat on the world and at the same time is remaining member of the organization. The members of international organizations can already now refuse from participating in the events Russia participates and to call the scientists to stop contacts with the Russian Federation. So the institutions for control monitoring have to be enhanced, the coordination of state and public structures as regards to Russian energy carriers and to reduce Russian import. The equipment manufacturers for fossil fuels produced have to be constantly in the focus of sanction policy. Those have been main conclusions. That's all from my side. Thank you. Igor Andreevich, you really touched very important points on that the import of Russian gas to EU has dropped, but we also have to look at the other side of the medal. The supplies of Russian liquefied gas increased. The same we can see on the oil. The oil embargo was introduced in December. In the beginning of that campaign, there was an estimate of how it works. The supplies of oil from Russia dropped a little, but from the second half of January it recovered because an amount of shadow tankers increased. We see that Russia is adopting to sanctions little by little. Since middle of January, supplies of oil from Russia almost achieved the level existing before embargo was introduced. Here I would like to address to Andrii Klymenko. If they have started in the monitoring group of Black Sea Studies Institute how the export of oil from Russia happens. Mr. Andrei, please tell us about that. I would pay your attention to the following proposals. First, how shall we regard the information which are very acceleratedly released by estimated global news agency, let's not name this, and same information provided by Russian Federation media. Russia says everything is very bad. Petroleum incomes are drastically shrinking. So Russia, through the first officials of the state, of the ministries, and says, everything good, girls and boys, your sanctions are working, are effective. We have catastrophe with incomes. The mass media shouldn't accept these statements without checking it. It should produce suspicion, at least, and at most, a wish to find out what happens really there. The studies we conduct since April last year, every day 24/7 regarding the exports of Russian oil and petroleum products from Black and Azov Sea ports, say so. That makes about 30% of Russian petroleum export. What they prove to? First of all, our first conclusion drawn, that Russia as a whole was able to reorient its oil export from European countries to Asian countries, to Africa and Middle East countries. That process is not yet complete, but every day, every month, new countries appear who are buying Russian oil and Russian petroleum products. Another big problem, and it is not subject to embargo, but theoretically should be subject to capping action when the operations are conducted by Western countries, tankers, and they're accordingly being insured by insurance company of Western countries. This is a separate topic. But there is another topic. As a matter of fact, the export of crude oil from Black Sea by Russian Federation to European countries didn't reduce almost. For example, in December, the ban of Russian crude oil was put in effect. In December, during the action of this ban, the ports of European 1 million ton was delivered from Black Sea petroleum to European ports. In January, this amount made 1,250,000 tons. In February, 1 million ton once again. So the crude oil from Russian Federation continues to income to European ports or to territorial waters of EU. First of all, 70 to 80% of that is provided by Greece, in which exclusive economic zone in the Laconic Bay, and we publish on our website tens of such examples with maps and routes of vessels. There's ship-to-ship transshipment of that petroleum. It is not physically coming to Greek ports, but it is reloaded in the exclusive economic zone, maritime exclusive economic zone of Greece to some other tankers who then follow to European ports including. In this sense, there is a huge problem consisting in that the control over execution of this embargo was laid. EU has no mandate to control all that. It was charged with the national governments, and obviously the execution of this embargo depends upon the policy each of the 27 EU countries is taken. Meaning, does this government has within its structure some entities, people and structures and the relevant budget to continuously monitor all that? The answer up to now, the numbers prove to all this is just is found just in the initial phase. And for the second, I want to pay attention first of all of our journalists, colleagues, both Ukrainian and both from Ukrainian and foreign mass media. Russian Federation and Putin, Russian president, right away after the implementation of price capping, issued an edict which categorically prohibits the Russian exporters from shipping oil under price capping conditions, and the Ministry of Energy of Russia, etc., introduced a special instructions, calculations of the formula to take into account how it all happens. So, most probably, no price capping is there in the oil export contracts to Asian, African, and Middle East countries. Is there. Obviously, nobody in Russian Federation shows those contracts to Western insurers. If shows, you have to understand, Russian Federation doesn't have, like in the EU or US, such a sacred commitments towards contracts. They may show any numbers in those contracts, so to tranquilize the owner of insurance company or of a tanker company. So it's just a huge problem. We understand that this is a bloody oil and bloody money that then are converted into shelling and new weapons, etc. in Russia, by Russia. So our proposal is the competent global world organizations have to find out about it, not just to multiply those news from Russia which say we have a very bad situation, but find out what really happens there. There is a very real suspicion of that the criminal and shadow schemes are working there. Thank you, Andrii, for your remarks about the bloody oil. The oil and gas incomes help Russia to continue waging war in the center of Europe. Last year, many sanctions have been imposed against the defense sector of Russia. Are those sanctions efficient? Is there remaining some space to use sanctions for more entities which were not enlisted there? I invite to the floor Pavlo Lakiychuk from Globalistics Center Strategy 21, head of military programs. Thank you. I prepared a formal report, but after listening to you, to colleagues, I decided to talk about somewhat different. It is possible that we are missing something very serious and important behind the numbers and diagrams. In 2014, when Russian Federation captured our Crimea and invaded Donbass in Ukraine, it was a shock for world society, for the global community, and as mass media and politicians of all the world said, they decided to introduce the largest ever scale against Russia through the history, aiming to enforce Russian Federation to refuse from their aggressive plans to liberate, to go out of Donbass and Crimea peacefully. I am frankly was crazy up to now about the statement of our partners who told us for 9 years that there is no military solution for Crimean problems, there is only political and diplomatic solution. They wanted to tell the truth, they were afraid to tell the truth. We are afraid of military liberation of Crimea, do not do it, but let's use political diplomatic solutions. Which ones can you propose? And they say, there is an option of embargo, of sanctions. We shall impose sanctions against Russia. Okay, through 9 years, we have seen certain insignificant effect of the sanctions in the first years. Then it was a shame to talk about seriousness of sanctions against Russia. They did have some effect, particularly against certain entities of Russian Federation, including in the Crimean Peninsula. But have they achieved the purpose to make Russia go out of Crimea? Hardly. So when in 2021, in February and March, the world started to talk about hell sanctions, might be somewhat larger than large-scale sanctions. It might have an effect. When they're talking about hell sanctions, infernal sanctions, which have to help us to win, to prevail over our enemy in the short-term perspective, they have to be really infernal sanctions. And they have to be financial sanctions to kill the financial machine of aggressor country, trade economical sanctions against separate enterprises and production branches, industries of the state, and personal, individual sanctions. This is an area of hidden justice against criminal individuals, I would say. The financial sanctions can bring clear effect, being infernal hell ones. I remember in March last year when Ukraine asked to disconnect Russia from SWIFT. They said, no, we shall give infernal sanctions, but not these ones. We have some result from sanctions, but it remains such a practice. When the sanctions are imposed, there is certain result, but in 2 to 3 months since that, Russian aggressor finds ways how to escape from that situation by finding black and gray and striped options to get rid of the sanction pressure. A bright example was given by Andrii, by Ihor Stukalenko, when we are observing first good intentions, and then in the short term, just in months, the enemy finds ways of escaping from those sanctions. And we don't know what to do later on, because the mechanism of designation of sanctions is a complicated mechanism which is discussed in the European Union. Then it is being blocked by Hungary or some other countries, but then it turns out to be that not only it's impossible to introduce those sanctions, but also it is difficult to continue implementing them later on. I mean that the sanction policy shall be performed by international governments, by the governments and international institutions. By the way, talking about governments, in the European Union, some countries have legislative mechanisms for sanctions to conduct those sanction measures. Other countries don't have. Could be said, we announce the sanctions and then everybody may or may not implement them. Talking about different countries, different members of you. For example, 20 billion euro of Russian oligarchs have been frozen by EU. Belgium and Luxembourg were the best ones, as much surprise it be. The share of Greece in those frozen assets made 212,201 euro, not millions even. Basically, actually, the sanction is there, but the EU country is not observing, is not following the sanctions. The national government doesn't want to implement the sanction. He joined to, and the Euro Commission has no mandate. Talking about mandates, like a joke. As it happens always, when an international organization tries to control the mandate, they say we don't have mandate, we don't have authority to do that, and the problem is over. Except for a mechanism to implement new sanctions, at least a mechanism for coordination, agreement of a single sanctions policy between the states who are implementing sanctions. I mean, not only European Union and the repo states who joined this international group, but also more broadly. It includes accordingly not only the state institutions, but also the public organizations and NGOs, which have to bear a monitoring function, finding gaps in the sanctions and streamline, orient national government and institutions to react by secondary sanctions and improvement of sanctional mechanisms. There should be a double feedback, kind of a circulation of sanction policy. There is a good word, I hear it in the text for sanctions implementation, counseling, when not just separate states are joining the international sanctions, but also companies and individuals. Canceling is more understood in the context of refusal from trading, making business with Russia by separate companies, but this term has to be used more broadly and being referred to the work of non-state sector, non-governmental sector. The question, will it work so? A positive answer depends significantly from mass media, from key opinion leaders,
в суспільствах різних держав стане працювати з Росією,
when it will be a shame to work with Russia in all the world, more shame it will bring them to earn profit from that. Only in that case this mechanism may become efficient. I believe one of the most important direction of this process is promoting this thesis broadly. If we work consistently, then the results will come and they will be destructive for Russia. I believe, not only I, the sanctions and our partners have to know it. Sanctions are an accessory, supplementary mechanism to help work our armed forces of Ukraine. Only armed forces of Ukraine can calm down the aggressor and put the relevant tranquilizing shot on them. And on top of the sanctions, give us tanks, give us a weapon, to say it in few words. Thank you, Pavel Petrovich. We already discussed that the coordinated policy is needed to enhance sanctions. And except on top of sanctions, there is a need to help to give material assistance and weapons to armed forces of Ukraine. Now Serhiy Zgurets will talk about how destructive is the effect of sanctions. He is the director of Defense Express Agency. Serhiy Grigorovich, please.
Сергій Григорович, у вас вимкнутий мікрофон.
Your mic is muted.
Спроба номер 2. Зараз мене чутно.
Can you hear me now? Yes, now we can hear you.
Я буду виступати як журналіст, і як
I will talk both as a journalist and as an expert, because the activity is connected to different aspects of Ukrainian army. What aggressor does by developing their weapons, and the issue of efficiency of sanctions is the concern of each Ukrainian, because we want to know, to calculate what is the reserve of strength of the enemy. I will start from the story. On the 18th March last year, we published an article under the name Is it true that French thermal optics are installed on the Russian tanks? So the tanks which were destroyed under Mariupol, we have seen the French manufactured infrared or thermal night vision devices which shouldn't be supplied due to the sanctions which happened after Crimea and after Dutch Boeing shutdown. It was believed that it will restrain and reduce the components to be used by Russian defense industry, but it didn't happen so, as it turned out. And France, it's two powerful companies, Sagen and Safran, which produce those optical devices, have been following their contracts to 2019, and they explain the contracts have been signed before sanctions were implemented. You see, the business interests are prevailing in the approach of separate European countries. Obviously, in 2022, the sanctions by G7, EU, US were implemented, and the situation with execution of sanctions improved. When we are talking about Russian tanks and those devices, we see a unique story. The new tanks produced by Ural Vagonzavod don't have those thermal vision devices. They put some old devices they have in their stores. The tank has night vision system with a distance of 2 kilometers only, instead of newer French with 5 kilometers distance. So that helped to reduce essentially the fighting potential of the enemy. By the way, the production of tanks has dropped significantly in Russia. They may produce just 20 new tanks a month, or update about up to 25 old tanks. So altogether 45 main battle tanks a month. If you calculate how many tanks have been destroyed, 3,250 Russian tanks were destroyed. So averagely 270 a month. We destroyed such a significant amount of the equipment. It makes the enemy to search for substitution. They bring Now T-61 tanks, which they plan to produce about 800 in 3 euros. And the quality of that indicator and the potential of Russian army will drop. Nobody remembers about super new Russian tanks. The production of new equipment stopped in Russia. It is due to that also the metal working machines are no more supplied to Russia. 90% of weapons is being produced on foreign metalworking machines, and now its supply has stopped, and it restrains Russians in their capacity to produce any weapon system using foreign machines. There's just a possibility to use Chinese metalworking machine to be used for military needs. They are negotiating with China about that. If we talk about other components, there are options when Russia is using efficiently the electronic component of foreign manufacture to create modern systems of weapon. And there was a rather interesting report by British Institute Russia. They analyzed 27 samples of a weapon used by Russian Federation. Fragments and components of those 27 samples were analyzed, which Russia used against Ukraine. What's interesting, 450 elements of foreign manufacture were found in those 27 samples, which were brought from the United States and other European countries, which formally introduced sanctions against Kremlin. Most of those 317 components were from American companies, and 80 components required export permission. It means that even when there are export restrictions and a strict system of control in the United States, there are some ways allowing Russian Federation to buy the components, even being under export restrictions. It means that the American system of export control has some holes used by Russia. Russian Federation now buys components through methods which are very difficult to control, because those components are dual purpose goods, and there have been paradoxical numbers when last year through Kazakhstan and through Armenia there was 3- to 4-fold increase of procurement of refrigerators and milk suckers. The birth rate in Armenia is dropping, but the milk suckers from Kazakhstan were increasing by 200%. Because all that was then conveyed to Russia, which used them to get out of the chips, the electronic components, so to use them in the military equipment. It means that the control of civil electronic devices requires certain solutions, aiming to reduce the possibility to use them for military purposes. I don't know how to do it, but the problem is there. And the third component, we are talking about American and European sanctions, is a significant number of electronic components remains, which is procured through China and Thailand. The volumes of Russian procurement there increased a lot. I have the statistics in the report. They increased significantly due to procurement from China to satisfy certain needs of Russia. There are also some things saying that there are non-selective sanctions of certain problems. Let's remind that Rosatom has an agreement with certain Russian companies to supply them as sensitive components for them to produce their weapons, their equipment. But the sanctions against Rosatom are not so much strong, so be able to completely stop the use of this method, not to finance by Rosatom the developments and not to supply parts or components for Russian Federation. The European Commission, which develops restrictions, is an overstructure, and the national governments of European countries, they have and profess different approaches to how certain restriction requirements should be implemented. For example, if Estonia introduced criminal liability for violation of sanction requirement, other countries don't do it, and there is a wish to use other countries to pass those deals. Other countries don't want to use sanctions against their national companies. There have been some cases when we started our talk. Mentioned France supplied components to Russian army for a long time. And the Central Defense Authorities of France didn't implement restrictions in that case. So in any way, the situation with sanctions against Russia is a very topical issue. And the Russian Federation also preserves a certain reserve of strength. It was said that the economic reserve of strength of Russia is sufficient to 2025 and the military one to 2026, which provided using accumulated reserves. And what is more fearful, the mobilization reserve of Russia can last up to 2030. With the intensity of fighting like today, the enemy has a certain advantage in the number of their troops. So we have to understand that the restrictions of the military technical component of Russia will be a maximum help, because to level out the mobilization component, and the European partners should take into account, talking about certain recommendations, they have been already pronounced by earlier. In any case, we can talk about that the export control should be reviewed and enhanced in all the countries and the jurisdictions. More improved and good forms of control on sanctioned goods should be introduced. Conditions should be created internationally for efficient detecting and elimination of such bypass networks. Many companies are actively acting there, trying to buy components for their equipment. We should not recommend third countries, parties to re-export or to transfer sanctioned goods to Russia. I don't know how to provide for that, but some ways should be searched for. And also the mechanism of enforcement should be proposed to EU. The EU has right and correct and proper overstructure, but real control and enforcement mechanisms should be introduced. And the work of EU, US, government and non-government organizations and journalists should be working maximally, make all efforts to detect the ways of supply of goods to Russian Federation and to be united into an interaction aiming to be another line of front to counteract new opportunities, additional opportunity for Russia. And we should take maximum efforts to degrade as quick as possible the Russian military potential. Unfortunately, it might not achieve results very quickly, but it have to be continuous and strong. So to achieve results. Thank you for very interesting presentation. We have a question from Joshua Gahi in the chat. 20 new tanks and update of 25 old a month. Is it more than the whole Europe is producing?
Зараз Європа
Europe now is manufacturing
менше.
less.
По Абрамсу складається 15 танків на місяць. Це
15 Abrams a month are produced or manufactured in US. Kraus Megaman produces Leopard tanks approximately in the same amount, but Leopards were not manufactured for a long time. So a part of that equipment of those vehicles have to be updated and also remanufacture and reproduction should happen. It is a serious challenge for German defense industry. It's one of the largest in Europe, but they need some time to really switch to military manufacturing regime. They are in the beginning of that process. Thank you very much. Also, I would like to invite to talk about recommendation Andrii Klymenko. He will tell about recommendation on how the sanction policy should develop further on, whether new institutions for export control should be created, how these institutions should be placed under. I believe Mykhailo Gonchar will wrap up as well. I will say from my part to this topic. I will add to what Serhiy Zgurets said right now. We have to understand that it is 1 year of sanctions during a large war period, and 1 year is enough to review and to improve the experience. It doesn't only concern Ukraine. Ukraine may be initiator of this process for the whole civilized world. But I will start from a remark which came into my mind after Serhiy Zgurets told about it. The history of special services of Soviet Union and Russia, meaning the history of organizations where Putin worked, and he knows perfectly about that. This history proves that the Russian Federation, during many years of its existence, was stealing everything, starting from the balls, from the ball bearings, and finishing with nuclear bombs, engines, turbines, and everything. Take into account the specifics of Russian president. They do the same, continue to do the same all over the world, meaning stealing. Talking about conclusions, the work on this project was useful personally for me due to that. I first of all made a conclusion. The impact of international sanctions, those infernal sanctions on the Russian Federation, is exaggerated. There is certain impact, and it is efficient, but its efficiency, its impact is over-exaggerated. Why it's important? It's important because it has to be correlated with duration of the war, and Serhiy started to talk about it. Look, 25 to 30% is the number forecasted by leading Western economists about the drop of Russian economics last year. But really, real drop was minus 2.5%, actually minus 8, but plus 5 was added by the underestimate by leading economists of the world, unfortunately, of internal factors. Russia started to abruptly increase in the state military defense procurement. They started to spend huge amount on production and repair of weapons, and it triggered new process for GDP growth. Accordingly, the period of fantastic oil prices for energy resources of last year, there was a historic record, over $5 billion added to the pocket of Russian Federation, thanks to those fantastic prices. And finally, we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of Russian Federation to adapt, also using criminal schemes, to all these sanctions. And for the third, the world underestimated the wish of the other half of the world, Asia, Africa, and Middle East, to earn on this problem. Understanding that certain thousand kilometers is the border between Russia and China, understanding that a significant part of Russian defense industry is found behind the Ural Mountains in Siberia, in the Far East, close to China. It can be forecasted they will use it, and what it will result in, it's very difficult to say now about that. Finally, talking about how, in my opinion, all this sanction system in the world should be updated and reviewed. Sanctions means economic war. Our friends in the West were afraid of such a definition. Now they are no more afraid. Sanction is an economic war. It is a component of a usual war, of conventional war. The war is commanded by General Staff Quarters. Our General Staff Quarter is communicating with the relevant headquarters of our ally countries, exchanging information. General Staff of Ukraine has to set up tasks of sanction policies. It's the first time I'm talking about it. It may sound strange, but they do better know what happens in the front line. And they can put a task to sanction people. They have to provide task specification to them. They will say, please, do in such a way for that microchip with such and such parameters would not come to Russia anymore because it is used in night vision devices or in other devices. They have to suggest that global sanction structure, a list of components and equipment to be abstracted from coming to Russia. And finally, we see there is interaction between the military of different countries. During this war, such a general staff and such a cooperation should exist between sanction authorities of different countries. Up to now, it seems there is no good interaction. Everybody knows American sanctions are the strongest, the most powerful one. So let's copy-paste American sanctions, etc. But really, a policy should be there in each country, not only to copy-paste good sanctions, but also to have its own investigational and sanctioning activity. Another problem to be solved, it is a proposal as well. Besides, state authorities, non-governmental organizations are very active in sanction area, not only in Ukraine, by the way, in many countries of the world as well. And we do have many requests for coordination from such separate groups. Somewhere they are connected with Ukrainians living abroad, being citizens of certain countries. Some of the journalists are making an investigation. We also have to consider this process. We have to think into how to unite the initiative of the civil society with all counterintelligence. I do underline counterintelligence analysis of those initiatives. How to unite this initiative of civil society in the countries, in our allies countries, with an official activity, because there is such a big volume of that the state authorities of any country simply of a separate single company wouldn't be able by them on to process such a huge volume. A few days ago, Americans added 25 prosecutors to the Ministry of Justice, to the Department of Justice. That means 25 offices. They will be exclusively dedicated to counteracting sanction evasion. It's a huge volume of work which is not able to cope with just governmental efforts. So we have to decide about cooperation, the waves of initiative investigative group of journalists in the area of sanction policy, cooperation with state bodies, and also between themselves. The general staff of sanctions should be exist, otherwise the gaps will be there, evasions will be there, and the war will last much longer and will bring more deaths and destructions. Thank you, Andrii. Before starting this event, we asked the audience, asking them to supply their questions for our roundtable. And there are some questions from Anna Solomoniuk. She is the student of the first year of journalist. We are welcoming these progressive youth who want to move towards this direction. The question is the following. What is your opinion about the sanctions Europe and US has to implement to stop Russian aggression? What sanctions have been most efficient to strike Russia? And all the sanctions implemented are not injuring, are not painful for Russia. Why is it so? Like they were intended to be. So, Mykhailo Mikhailovich, I propose you now to wrap up our roundtable and to parallelly answer the question set to our experts. Please, Mykhailo Mikhailovich. Thank you. I will not put the video on because I'm on mobile only now, so to provide for a stable connection, I will only talk. To start with, before answering the questions, somebody else might want to answer them. Anyway, I will add to what to the previous talks in my small presentation, but I will not come back to the topic of incomes Russia has. You see, the year 21 brought it sufficient monies to continue the war. And the topic now actively discussed about the budget deficit of Russia. In the first quarter, there is a drop of budget. But we haven't to be relaxed about it. I do absolutely agree with Andrii. They want us to believe in that Russia is running out of money. Russia is not running out of money. If we look at different options of evasion schemes to evade Western sanctions, then the overall scheme is clear. But it is important here to understand all the details and nuances of how it works. Take into account that Russia, through 8 years after beginning of the aggression in 2014, they understood how the US and European sanctions work. They drew the relevant conclusions and taking into account that they have been preparing themselves to intrude, to make this large aggression. They understood there would be hell or infernal sanctions, like Biden's administration called them. What we can see is the Biden administration doesn't use this term anymore. So working within project tasks, I paid attention to an interesting points which happen in the context of evasion of sanction policy. What Serhiy Zgurets mentioned, and Mr. Lakiychuk, about the components and parts and the whole devices of Western production can be found on the destroyed Russian vehicles. So on one side, the European manufacturers, after they see that they shouldn't do it, so they stopped that supplies. But there are not only European manufacturers, there are other manufacturers and other options of supply and delivery. In this context, I paid attention to multi-layer chain of supplies, which was developed by Russians. Now, upon the results of 2022, it is functioning. What do I mean? There is such a state as Taiwan, an island state. And the drama of Taiwan is evolving, is developing before our eyes, and eventually with involvement of China. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear. The aggression from continental China is much possible against Taiwan, so on. But nevertheless, for island Taiwan, exactly China is the greatest trade partner. 42% of Taiwan's trade falls to continental China. Next day, after Russian aggression on the 25th of February, Taiwan introduced restrictions for supply of chips of two global Taiwanese companies, KSMC and UMC. Later on, all this was formalized in April with an official implementation of sanctions and joining Western sanctions, etc. What happened upon 22? 10% growth of trade between Taiwan and Russia, direct trade. In this context, one of Taiwanese transnational conglomerates. It is located in Taiwan, but it is transnational. Different structures belong to its structure. Subsidiaries, 15 Italian, French, Swiss, and German manufacturers within the framework of such an internal holding cooperation, so they have rather a large space for maneuvering. Obviously, Taiwanese government once more in the beginning of this year considered enhancement of sanctions regime. Along with that, one of the ministries of Taiwan responsible for foreign trade, they said that the growth of export takes place of high-tech Taiwanese products, namely the metalworking machines, at the background of avalanche-like drop of export to Western countries due to some reasons. Along with that, the Taiwanese products, first of all, talking about the relevant tax, it is more universal compared to European American. Obviously, there is an official ban. Nobody may violate it, no one entity. Economic energy. But at the same time, the Taiwanese source indicates the following scheme. Suddenly, a powerful demand appeared from Mongolia for certain works and supply of equipment in favor of some Mongolian structure. A Chinese partner appeared because Mongolia has no exit to the ocean. somewhere in Shanghai or Guangzhou, Hong Chinese partner appeared to provide so-called logistical operations to transfer those cargo. In this way, the final destination of this product would be either China or Mongolia. And then it follows what about Andrii Klymenko talked. The border between Russia and China, and you also should include Mongolia. So in this scheme, Russia is not shown as a final consumer. So this product, this of Taiwanese holding, which was sent to Russia before sanction times. Now they use such a scheme. The subject is known, the corporation, Russian missile weapons, development of maritime anti-vessel and other kind of missiles, air bombs, the cruiser missiles, or region-guided bombs, Zvezda Star, Aviastar, Fakel, Ural, transport machine building plant, which produces self-propelled artillery. Scientific Research Institute Burevestnik for vessel artillery. The already mentioned Ural Zavod and so on. So there are increase of supplies, different metalworker machines, different. It means that Russia not only intended but also launched a new cycle of new weapons. Let it be old types or models, they can scale them up and they can continue to produce them in bulk, in mass. An illustrative example of that is which surprised the Taiwanese source. And Kazakhstan was mentioned by colleagues here. Last year, Kazakhstan increased by 18 times the import of metalworking machines from Taiwan. Obviously, we don't see that Kazakhstan really would have some industrial boom to produce certain equipment, certain vehicles requiring great number of metalworking machines. Anyway, the phenomenon took place. This scheme was realized, and we understand what for it served. A similar scheme works in Europe. There are many of those schemes. As a matter of fact, there is a known German holding company, a multi-branched one, which traditionally has powerful ties with Gazprom. It is multilateral, but formally its activity was suspended, but from information we get from Russia, they are just hiding, silent. They continue invisibly for the media to act moreover. It is easy to do in silence due to the censorship now in Russia, now in place in Russia. So let me be restricted with these examples, and now I shall tell a few things to wrap up. Also to say about peaceful space and peaceful atom. Not only that, but also just ordinary metal working machines, which can be used to manufacture military equipment, weapons. In this context, everything colleagues were mentioned about such a basic conclusion is coming to mind. Connected to that, we have to stimulate our Western partners to launch the COM2, I would say. During the Cold War times in 1941, an informational committee was created on multilateral export control by 17 countries of the West, so not to allow the leaking of Western technologies to USSR, aiming to reduce increase growth of its military potential under the relevant name Infocom. Such a structure is needed now, which could be more successful than that network of different coordinating structures at different levels existing now, which brings very restricted result, as we can see. I do agree absolutely with Andrii Klymenko that greater coordination between NGOs and government and entities, experts, mass media is necessary. It is already existing, but not in sufficient degree. Especially when we look at what happens here inside Ukraine. It was said about international situation, but we have also to review what we have inside Ukraine, where we do underwork. On one side, such an interaction is there. On the other hand, we see that those persons or organizations which should be already for a long time enlisted into those sanctions, they are not there. Obviously, it's difficult to embrace unembraceable, but it also proves to that there is insufficient interaction. Moreover, sometimes with our not well thought actions, we also damage, harm the international cooperation. One of the freshest online examples is what happens around Kobolev affair. Andrii Kobolev, the ex-head of Naftogaz, which is now under attention of NABU, Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Bureau, he played a significant role to set up communications in the beginning of Russian intrusion with our Western partners, with the United States, exactly on sanction interaction. And we see the ex-ambassador of US to Ukraine, John Herbst, now is sending a letter to Ukrainian officials. Please review your decisions about Kobolev, because this person is one of the links acting and interacting in the system of coordination. Take into account his non-corporate status now, and he's an independent professional now, but he plays an important role from the point of view of coordination of international efforts on energy sanctions against Russia. And here there are some activities, and he was restricted in his movement, so he will be restricted in that activity, moreover, not to talk about the seizure, about arrest, especially now when such an additional sanction doping against Russia is necessary. In this sense, obviously, we have internal coordination is required and international interaction. So to really convert those sanctions into infernal ones. After the beginning of aggression against Ukraine 9 years ago, and after the full-fledged Russian aggression last year, it proves not only in the need to enhance the sanction pressure, but the sanction regime should be switched into the regime of total economic isolation of aggressor. We understand it can be made by Western countries, the G7, EU countries, and NATO countries. But without that, other countries, it will be difficult to stimulate other countries for such a decisive sanction activities. against Russia.
Ну, і мені здається, от якраз
So I believe
усвідомлені нашими партнерами не
our partners are not sufficiently aware of the need of such step, so it requires activation of diplomatic efforts officially and at public level. So to make them stop being afraid about that and to switch to more strict and rigorous actions, which would result into infernal sanctions, like they named them before. So that is an answer to the question which sanctions EU and the US have to undertake. I answered this question. The question which of the sanctions stroke Russia at most, I would say, upon last year,
найменше вдарили по Росії. Санкції в
conclusions, I would answer the least to strike Russia via energy sector sanctions. It is clear from one side because although EU introduced the sixth sanction package 30th of May, but we see that the oil ban started in the end of the year, 5th of December. Next, its part started already this year. So this time lag was beneficial for Russia. And the play of Russia in OPEC Plus format at the global oil market when they chase the prices up and haven't been answered adequately, although it was going about creation of a pool, of a cartel, of it was discussed about creating a pool of consumers to respond to OPEC plus the cartel of suppliers. So we see that the sanctions worked randomly, but they don't bring immediate and destructive effect, preventing Russia from continuing aggression. And the third question was about whether sanctions are traumatizing for Russian citizens. They will feel it later on due to inertia. So we have to work upon that, both we and our partners. That's all from one side. We'd like to thank you for your attention, for your participation. Everybody who worked on this, who is working on this project, we shall continue this work. The relevant work was conducted before this, during these 6 months of the project, and from the renewed platform, it will be continued. Thank you, Mykhailo Mikhailovich. Unfortunately, our conference comes to its end. So during our roundtable, the head of EU diplomacy, Joseph Borrell, in the interview to Europe, said that the European Union already almost exhausted its punishment measures against Russia, so the attention of the bloc should be concentrated on financial and military support of Ukraine. Upon the conclusions of our roundtable, we might say it is not time now to stop with the sanctions or to dwell on it. There is what to do with the sanctions to enhance them, so we shall pass database of the entities to be sanctioned to our Western partners and to see this place to move ahead. We assure an 11, 12 and 13th package of sanctions will be adopted before up to the end of the war. So the aggressor would lose its capacity to wage war in the 21st century. So the enhancement of sanctions pressure and provision for observing the current restrictions have to be parallel in tracks. We shall continue our activity on our side. We shall transfer the developed database to our partners. I thank everybody for participation in today's efficient roundtable. We shall continue to work. We thank Renaissance Foundation for the support of the project.
Слава Україні!
Glory to Ukraine.
Героям слава.
Glory to heroes.
Думаю, можна вже завершувати.
До побачення усім.
До побачення.
Bye-bye.
Так.